It didn't start with women, it started with a message, a quiet whisper repeated 1,000 times until it became truth. At first it sounded harmless, even noble. Be strong, be independent. You don't need a man. The seed was planted softly, buried under slogans about empowerment and equality. But like any seed, it grew. And over time what sprouted wasn't freedom, it was division. Because every movement that begins in pain eventually learns to feed on it. And that's what happened here. For decades, women were told that men were the reason they suffered, the reason for their silence, their sacrifices, their lost potential. It became a simple story, easy to understand, easier to sell. The villain was clear, the hero was waiting to rise, and soon every form of media began watering that seed. Commercials showed women breaking free from men. Movies glorified the idea of the strong woman standing above the weak man. Talk shows mocked husbands, fathers, boyfriends, calling it humor. It wasn't humor, it was hypnosis. Because when you repeat a message long enough, the mind stops questioning it, and before anyone realized, an entire generation of women began seeing men not as partners, but as obstacles. It wasn't their fault, they were raised on it. Every story, every headline, every online trend carried the same undertone. Men hold you back, men are the problem, you'll never be free until you outgrow them. And they believed it. Because when you're told you've been wronged, anger feels like justice, resentment feels like empowerment, hate feels like healing. But here's the quiet truth no one admits. You can't teach hate without breaking something inside the student. And that's what happened to the modern woman. She learned to build her strength on rejection, not balance. She learned to speak louder but feel less. She learned to protect herself from the very thing she once longed for, masculine warmth. That's the tragedy. The seed wasn't about liberation, it was about separation, because a divided world is easier to control. And while men and women were busy blaming each other, someone else was profiting from the fight. Someone who planted that seed and watched it grow into the forest of confusion we live in now. Section 2. The Inversion of Blame. Every movement needs a villain. Without one, there's no story, no purpose. So when society began to reshape its narrative, it found the perfect target: men. It didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, a subtle rewriting of history. One headline, one sitcom, one classroom discussion at a time. The story became simple enough for everyone to believe. Men built the world, yes, but they built it for themselves. Men held power, yes, but they used it to suppress. Every achievement of humanity suddenly came with a hidden crime, and soon masculinity itself became guilty by association. The very traits that once built civilizations, strength, leadership, stoicism, discipline, were rebranded as toxic, oppressive, outdated, while the chaos that replaced them was sold as progress. The inversion was complete when men began apologizing for being what they were born to be, when fathers were mocked in commercials, when husbands became the punchline of every sitcom, when teachers told young boys to sit still while praising girls for their emotional sensitivity. It wasn't balance, it was reversal, and every generation raised under that reversal grew a little more detached from truth. You could see it in the language. Words changed. Provider became patriarch, protector became oppressor, even masculine became a warning label. The more the world attacked manhood, the more women believed they were rising, but they weren't rising, they were reacting. And reaction is not liberation, it's dependency in disguise, because when you define yourself by opposition, you become a mirror of the thing you hate. And now, decades later, you can feel the consequences everywhere. A generation of men walking on eggshells, careful not to offend, careful not to lead, careful not to be too much of anything. And a generation of women who can't tell the difference between protection and control, between guidance and dominance, between love and weakness. That's what inversion does. It doesn't destroy truth, it just flips it upside down. It turns strength into guilt, care into manipulation, and partnership into a battle for moral superiority. It was never about equality, it was about rebalancing power and keeping people too busy fighting to notice who's writing the rules. Section 3. The Feminine Rebellion. Rebellion used to mean something sacred. It was the voice of the oppressed demanding truth. The courage to rise against real chains, real pain, real injustice. But somewhere along the way, that rebellion was hijacked, reshaped, rebranded, and sold back to women as something new. Freedom from men. It sounded empowering, it looked heroic, it felt righteous. But it wasn't rebellion against oppression anymore. It was rebellion against connection. Because the truth is, women never hated men. They were taught to. They were taught that love makes them weak, that compromise means submission, that trusting a man means betraying every woman who ever suffered before them. And that's how the feminine rebellion lost its heart. the rebellion became performance, a ritual of defiance without a cause, anger without direction, a movement without meaning, because you can't build peace by destroying what completes you. You can see it everywhere now. In movies, in music, in casual conversation, this quiet pride in not needing anyone. Every lyric, every slogan, every influencer repeating the same mantra, never depend on a man. He's replaceable, you are enough. And maybe she is. But being enough doesn't mean being alone. Independence without intimacy isn't power, it's loneliness dressed in designer clothes. What started as empowerment has become exhaustion, because no one told her the truth, that the feminine doesn't lose power when it softens, it gains it. Real rebellion would have been balance, not choosing dominance but harmony, not rejecting masculinity but redefining the relationship with it. But the world never rewarded balance, it rewarded outrage. Anger sells, division gets clicks, conflict keeps you consuming, so the rebellion kept burning, and the more it burned, the more it consumed the very thing it claimed to protect, the feminine spirit itself. Now you can feel it, in her tone, in her posture, in her eyes. The woman who once radiated warmth now radiates defense. The woman who once inspired men now competes with them, and she can't understand why no one wants to fight beside her anymore. That's the price of a rebellion that forgot its purpose. It stopped fighting for peace, and started fighting against love. Section 4. The manufactured enemy. Hatred doesn't just appear, it's built, brick by brick, word by word, and behind every movement that divides, there's always someone counting the profit. Because when men and women were united, families were strong, communities were stable, and people needed less from the system. But when they were separated, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, they became perfect consumers, perfectly distracted, perfectly divided. That's what no one wants to admit. The war between men and women isn't organic, it's engineered. You can trace it through decades of marketing, commercials that mock fathers, sitcoms that glorify independence but mock tradition, news headlines designed to pit one gender against the other, music videos celebrating promiscuity but sneering at loyalty. Every message has the same undertone: don't trust, don't commit, don't connect, because lonely people buy more, angry people scroll longer, confused people obey easier, and while we argue about who's to blame, men or women, someone else is quietly winning. Corporations thrive when the home falls apart. Governments grow stronger when families weaken. Media profits when outrage trends. It's not conspiracy, it's business, and we're the product. Think about it. If men and women actually respected each other again, half the economy would collapse. The self-help industry, the dating apps, the cosmetic empires, the endless stream of empowerment merchandise, all of it depends on disconnection. Because a fulfilled woman doesn't need validation, and a peaceful man doesn't need escape. So they keep us at war, not with guns but with words, not with violence but with narratives. They whisper that masculinity is dangerous, that femininity is weak, and both sides believe it, because it's easier than facing the truth. We were never meant to be enemies. The modern woman isn't evil. The modern man isn't broken. They're both victims of the same machinery, one that realized love doesn't sell as well as conflict. So they keep feeding us new battles to fight, sexes, politics, ideologies, identities. As long as we're angry, we'll never notice the cage we're building together. And the saddest part, it worked. Men stopped leading, women stopped trusting, and the connection that once built civilization has been reduced to hashtags and heartbreak. Hatred was never natural, it was manufactured, and now it's mass-produced. Section 5. The death of partnership. Once upon a time, love was simple. Two people facing the world together. Not perfectly, not equally in every way, but harmoniously. They needed each other, and they knew it. That was their strength. But now, love has become a competition, a performance, a quiet smiling war where no one wins. Partnership died the moment equality turned into rivalry, the moment connection became a contest. Now every relationship feels like a negotiation. Who gives more? Who sacrifices less? Who holds the power? No one asks who's safe here anymore. They ask who's in control, and that shift changed everything, because when love turns into leverage, trust disappears. Every act of kindness feels like strategy. Every disagreement feels like manipulation. Every touch feels like a transaction. The world told women to never depend on men, and told men that women were impossible to please, so both stopped trying. Now you see it everywhere. Couples sitting in restaurants, eyes glued to phones instead of each other. Arguments disguised as boundaries, relationships reduced to energy exchanges and self-worth alignment. It sounds enlightened, it feels hollow, because love doesn't survive in balance sheets. It survives in surrender, the willingness to trust, to give, to need. But in the modern world, needing someone is weakness. Depending on anyone is failure, so people build walls instead of homes. They talk about self-love, but what they really mean is self-protection. And the bed that once held intimacy is now filled with distance. Men feel unwanted unless they perform. Women feel unsafe unless they dominate. And both secretly miss a world they were told to hate. The one where love meant us, not me. Partnership didn't die because people stopped caring. It died because people stopped believing it was safe to care. When you grow up being told that men are dangerous and women are deceptive, how can you ever relax into trust? How can you ever build something that lasts, when you're both waiting for the other to betray you? The modern relationship is a cold war, smiles on the surface, suspicion underneath, intimacy replaced by ideology, love replaced by language games, and while everyone's trying to win, no one notices that the game itself was designed to keep both sides losing, because the truth is, love was never supposed to be fair. It was supposed to be real, and real connection can't exist in a world where everyone's too busy defending themselves to let anyone in. Section 6. The rise of the narrative. If you want to change how people think, you don't need to argue with them, you just need to tell better stories. And that's exactly what society did. They built a narrative, a never-ending story that whispered, then shouted, then screamed, men are the problem. It started subtly, a sitcom joke here, a romantic comedy there, a strong female lead who didn't need anyone. It looked harmless, even inspiring, but repetition turns fiction into faith. Every movie, every ad, every pop song carried the same emotional rhythm. Man hurts woman, woman heals herself, woman wins alone. No nuance, no complexity, just one message: you're better without him. The narrative sold beautifully. It made money, it made heroes, it made identity, but it also made emptiness, because when you teach women that men are obstacles, you teach men that love is danger. When every story paints him as the villain, why would he ever show up to play the hero? Soon, even empathy became gendered. A man in pain, he's weak. A woman in pain, she's brave. A man wanting love, he's desperate. A woman wanting love, she's empowered. The script flipped so far that even compassion became political, and the algorithms made it worse. They learned what makes us angry. They learned that outrage keeps us online, so they fed both sides more of it. Men are trash, women are delusional, a never-ending cycle of poison. Every scroll, every swipe, every trending sound was another drop of fuel on a fire that no one remembered lighting. Now the narrative writes itself. Influencers mock traditional relationships. Comedians joke about divorce like it's self-care. Podcasts debate gender like it's a sport. But beneath the noise, something real is dying. Our ability to see each other as human. We've replaced tenderness with theory, connection with commentary, love with ideology. And yet, even after decades of programming, something inside us still resists. Because truth doesn't vanish, it hides. And deep down, both men and women still feel the same ache. This can't be what we were meant for. That's the power of the narrative. It doesn't need to convince you completely. It just needs to confuse you enough to forget what real love looked like. And once you forget, it can sell you everything you'll buy to replace it. Section 7. The broken mirror. She doesn't realize it, but the war she's fighting isn't with men anymore. It's with herself. Because after years of being told that strength means rejection, that softness means submission, and that peace means surrender, she's begun to see everything nurturing, loving, and feminine as weakness. And when she looks in the mirror now, she doesn't just see a woman, she sees conflict. The reflection staring back isn't her enemy, but it feels like one. The same traits that once made her radiant: empathy, grace, gentleness, trust, now look foreign, outdated, shameful. She was taught to despise those things, to cut them out, to trade them for armor, posture, performance. But you can't destroy what you were born to be without destroying yourself in the process. That's what's happening quietly inside millions of women today, a civil war of identity. Half of them wants to be loved, the other half refuses to need it. Half wants to rest, the other half only feels safe when fighting. And every time they try to find balance, the world reminds them which side wins. You see it in their faces, the confident smiles that never reach the eyes, the voices that sound powerful but crack at the edges, the laughter that feels rehearsed, the strength that's really exhaustion. Because deep down, every woman knows that hating the masculine also means hating the part of herself that was meant to harmonize with it. That's the tragedy no one talks about. When you erase men from meaning, you erase the mirror that gave women theirs. Masculinity and femininity were never rivals, they were reflections. each defined by the other, each incomplete without the other. But the world shattered that mirror and told her to call the broken pieces progress. Now she stares at those shards, each one showing a different version of who she's supposed to be. The boss, the survivor, the goddess, the savage, but none of them feel like home, because home was never supposed to be a title. It was supposed to be a feeling, and she hasn't felt at home in herself for a very long time. Every morning she puts on her confidence like makeup, and every night she wipes it off, seeing the quiet fatigue she can't post about. The mirror doesn't lie. It shows everything the slogans don't. The cost of pretending, the fatigue of fighting, the sadness of separation, and the reflection keeps asking her the same silent question. If this is what strength looks like, why does it feel so heavy? Section 8. The silent men. They didn't fight back, not loudly at least. There were no marches, no manifestos, no angry headlines. Just silence. The kind of silence that creeps in slowly, like the tide pulling back from the shore. So gentle at first you barely notice it's gone, until one day you look around and realize the ocean isn't there anymore. That's what happened to men. For years they tried to understand, to adapt, to become softer, more empathetic, more sensitive, hoping it would make them more accepted, more lovable. But it didn't, because the moment they stopped being the rock, they stopped being respected. And the moment they showed emotion, they were called weak. No matter what they did, it was wrong. If they led, they were controlling. If they followed, they were pathetic. If they provided, it was expected. If they struggled, it was shameful. So they learned the one thing the world never prepared for. They learned to disappear, not physically, emotionally, spiritually. They went quiet, pulled back, built their own peace in solitude. You see them now, the men who no longer argue, no longer chase, no longer explain. They work, they lift, they create, they stay silent, because silence is the only space left where they're not being told they're wrong. And in that silence, something shifted. The world started to feel emptier, not because men stopped existing, but because their presence, their grounding, their steadiness was gone. Women began to feel it too, though they didn't know what to call it. They said the world felt colder, that relationships felt unstable, that love felt uncertain. They didn't realize it's because the masculine presence, that quiet protective energy, had withdrawn. Now, when a man meets a woman, he doesn't see her as potential anymore. He sees risk, he sees danger, he sees headlines, hashtags and heartbreak. So he stays polite, but distant, friendly but detached, physically there, emotionally gone. He learned peace by absence, because every attempt at presence was punished. That's the tragedy no one talks about. The silence of men isn't apathy, it's defense, it's exhaustion, it's the sound of generations who gave everything and got blamed for it anyway. And though the world pretends not to notice, it feels their absence everywhere. The home feels colder, the streets feel rougher, the laughter feels thinner. Because when men stop caring, the world doesn't just lose strength, it loses direction, it loses balance, and the women who were told they didn't need men are beginning to realize that what they lost wasn't ownership, it was harmony. Section 9. The Reckoning. Every lie has an expiration date. Eventually it collapses under the weight of its own emptiness. That's where we are now. The slogans are fading, the noise is quieting, the smiles are starting to crack, and beneath it all, something honest is beginning to stir, a quiet recognition that this isn't working. The hatred doesn't feel like power anymore, the loneliness doesn't feel like freedom, and the noise doesn't drown out the silence inside. Women are beginning to feel it. Men have felt it for years. The distance between them, the cold, the tension, the mistrust. It's not natural. It was taught, it was sold, it was planted. And for what? So that we could all feel equal? No, so we could all feel alone, because a divided people are easier to control. And the longer we keep fighting ghosts, the longer the real architects of this misery will keep collecting profit from our pain. But here's the truth they didn't expect. No matter how much programming you run, you can't kill human nature. You can't erase the need for love. You can't rewrite the biology of connection. It's still there, buried under pride, under pain, under decades of deception. But it's still there. That's the reckoning, not revenge, not rage, but realization. Men aren't the enemy. Women aren't victims. We've both been poisoned, fed lies until we forgot how to trust each other, how to admire each other, how to need each other. And maybe that's the cruelest part. We didn't just lose love, we lost the memory of what it felt like. But the truth is patient. It waits. It always does. Because somewhere out there, men and women are beginning to remember, to look at each other not through filters of fear or ideology, but through the eyes of something ancient, something simple, something real. They're realizing that masculinity isn't toxic, it's protective, that femininity isn't weak, it's healing, and that when both meet without ego, something sacred returns. The world told us to choose sides, but the truth was never on either side. It was always in the space between, in the balance, in the partnership, in the peace that comes when two halves remember they were never meant to compete. They were meant to complete. That's the reckoning. Not a revolution, but a return to honesty, to harmony, to the ancient truth that built everything we once called love. And maybe, just maybe, when the noise finally stops and the pride finally fades, we'll look across that broken divide, see each other clearly for the first time in decades, and whisper the only apology that ever mattered. I forgot you weren't my enemy,